Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our special 9 days edition of the Spiritual Mentoring Group. Welcome everybody who is live with us and those who will be watching by video. I'm Penina Taylor, in case you don't know, and I just want to thank you for joining me. Now, today's class is going to be a little bit less on the spiritual emphasis and a little bit more on the practical emphasis. It's meant to be kind of a primer, if you will, on what's going on during this time of year, and a refresher course for those of us who already know what's going on but might need some reminding of some things. And then at the end, we'll conclude with just a couple of thoughts that are a little bit less practical, a little bit more spiritual. So anyway, we have just entered a period of time called the 9 days. Okay, Thursday marked the beginning of the 9 days, or rather Thursday night, Friday, marked Rosh Chodesh Av, the first of the month of Av. And so what does that mean? What does it mean that we're in the 9 days, which is part of a period that we call the 3 weeks? So first of all, a little bit of background. What's going on during this period? The 9 days during the 3 weeks. The 9 days started on Friday, which was Rosh Chodesh, or the first of the month of Av. There are 6 fast days on the Jewish calendar, 2 of which take place during the summer and within 3 weeks of each other, right? We're currently in the middle of those 3 weeks, but we'll get into that in a moment. The 6 fast days are remembered by the saying long, short, male, female, black, and white. The long is for the 17th of Tammuz. That's the fast that happened about 2 weeks ago now. And it's called long because it happens in the summer. It's a daytime fast, not a 25-hour fast, but because it's in the summer, it makes it very long, almost as long as the 25-hour fasts, okay? So long is the 17th of Tammuz, like I said, which is what happened about 2 weeks ago. Short is the 10th of Tevet, and it's called short because it's in the winter. Male is for the fast of Gedalia, because Gedalia was a man. Female is for the fast of Esther. Black is for Tisha B'av, and white is for Yom Kippur. Now, like I said, this is just a way for us to remember the 6 different fasts: long, short, male, female, black, and white. The last 2, Tisha B'av and Yom Kippur, are considered major fast days. They last 25 hours. They last from just before sundown till after complete darkness the next day. So 25 hours, just like a regular Shabbat. The other 4 are considered minor fasts, and they occur from sunrise to sunset. They're daytime fasts. They're not 25-hour fasts. Now, although Yom Kippur is the only fast that's biblically mandated, as in that the Torah tells us we must observe it, the fast of Esther, of course, can be found in the book of Esther. So even though it's not commanded, although the book of Esther does document the fact that Mordechai, as leader of the Jewish community, took it upon the Jewish community, and they accepted as an obligation for all of the coming generations that it would be observed. So it's kind of a semi-commanded fast day, because the Jewish community, in the book of Esther, we have the documentation that the entire Jewish community took it upon themselves to observe the fast of Esther, okay? The story of Gedalia is found in the Tanakh as well, although there are no actual mentions it's not actually mentioned that it would be a fast day. It's just, that's not part of the story. However, we fast in remembrance of the event, and that it marked the end of Jewish autonomy following the destruction of the first temple. You can find that story in Malachim Bet, 2 Kings, chapter 25, verses 25 and 26. Or you can just read the whole chapter to get a better picture of it. Now, before I get into the details of our upcoming major fast, Tisha B'av, I'd like to show you, though, where all of the fast days are actually mentioned in the Tanakh. Now, I don't know, you may or may not be familiar with this, but I know that it was kind of surprising to me to see that it was in the Tanakh even before the events happened that led to these fasts. So it says in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 19, Thus says Hashem of hosts, the fast of the 4th, the fast of the 5th, the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th months will become joy, gladness, and cheerful feasts for the house of Judah. So love, truth, and peace. Basically, what it's saying is this is a prophecy that at some point in our history, these 4 fasts, which are minor fasts that we've taken upon ourselves as a people, that these fasts will no longer be days of mourning, they will be days of joy. So at some point, life is going to change for the Jewish people, and we're no longer going to be mourning the destruction of the temple. Okay, so the fasts are like this. The fast of the 4th month is the 17th of Tammuz. Okay, last month was the month of Tammuz on the Hebrew calendar. Okay, and it is the 4th month of the year. Counting from when? Not counting from Rosh Hashanah, because Rosh Hashanah is the physical New Year, but it's counting from Passover, which is the spiritual New Year. Okay, so 4 months ago was Passover, right? Or 3 months ago, because this is the 4th month. But now we've entered, since Friday, we entered the month of Av. So the fast of the 5th month is Tisha B'av. The fast of the 7th month is the fast of Gedalia, which is right after Rosh Hashanah. And the fast of the 10th is the fast of the 10th of Tevet. So the only 2 fasts not mentioned in this passage are Yom Kippur and the fast of Esther, both of which are found elsewhere in the Tanakh, as I mentioned. So also all 4 of these commemorate very sad events which are in conjunction with the destruction of one or both of the temples and the exile. So the implication is that these fasts, which we mourn, which we observe in mourning and remembrance of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, there's going to come a point in time where things are going to be restored or renewed in such a way that we'll no longer need to mourn this loss because it will have been replaced. So it's a promise of better things to come. Okay. Now, in case you missed it, the 3 weeks began, as I said, with the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, which was actually this year pushed off until the 18th because it occurred on Shabbat. The only fast day which may occur on Shabbat is Yom Kippur, not only because of its importance, but because Hashem himself referred to Yom Kippur as the Shabbat Shabbaton. Sometimes this is translated as a Sabbath of complete rest, but probably more accurately simply translated as a Sabbath of Sabbaths. And because it includes the same prohibitions of Shabbat, plus those specifically for the holiday, it is not ever pushed off. We're not supposed to fast on Shabbat. Why? Because Shabbat is not a day for mourning. It's a day for celebration with God. This one day, however, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is commanded by God, and it is commanded by date specifically to be observed on the 10th of the month. So therefore, it is never pushed off, not even on Shabbat. However, the others are. And this year, that means that the fast of 17th of Tammuz, which occurred on Shabbat, and Tisha B'av, which is exactly 3 weeks later, are a day later on the calendar this year. So 17th of Tammuz, we observed on the 18th of Tammuz, and the 9th of Av will be observed on the 10th of Av, which is next Sunday, okay? Or rather, this Sunday, all right? It's 5 days away. All right, so this year we observed the fast of 17th of Tammuz on Sunday, July 1st. Now, on the 17th of Tammuz, we remember the reason that we're fasting is for 5 great catastrophes which occurred in Jewish history. All right, so what are these 5 catastrophes that happened that we're fasting in remembrance of? Well, number 1 is this is the date our tradition tells us that Moshe broke the tablets at Har Sinai in response to the sin of the golden calf. kind of like a bruise on the calendar. This date, as well as Tisha B'av, became a bad day for the Jewish people throughout history. It's incredible how many bad things have happened to the Jewish people during these 3 weeks, but specifically on the 17th of Tammuz and on the 9th of Av. All right, number 2, during the times of the first temple, on the 17th of Tammuz, the daily offerings had to be suspended because the Babylonian siege on Jerusalem. Because of the siege, the Kohanim, the priests, could no longer obtain animals. They had a few that they were able to use, in stock or whatever, but there came a point where they ran out of animals, and so they were no longer able to offer the offerings, and that was a big deal. And this siege resulted in the destruction of the first temple on the 9th of the month of Av, 3 weeks later. Okay, so they were able to take siege of the temple or Jerusalem. Probably it was the walls. I think it was the walls around Jerusalem. But remember, back then Jerusalem was very small, so it wasn't that much bigger than the Temple Mount itself. And then the siege lasted for 3 weeks before we got to the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av in Hebrew is Tisha B'av, as I mentioned, and because of it, that is the most solemn day of the Jewish calendar. Okay, 490 years later, after the destruction, or the siege in this case, because we're talking about the 17th of Tammuz, not Tisha B'av, but Tisha B'av, 17th of Tammuz, 490 years later, Jerusalem's walls were once again breached. In the interim, we had been exiled. People had come back. We had had rebuilt the temple. And 490 years after, which is 770s, by the way, if you are a person who likes to study prophecies in the book of Daniel, okay? 490 years after the siege of Jerusalem the first time, leading to the destruction of the first temple, Jerusalem's walls were again breached, and this time it was not the Babylonians, it was the Roman army, which led to the eventual destruction of the second temple on Tisha B'av. Number 4, before the Great Revolt in 66 CE, a Roman general named Apostomus burned a Torah scroll, and this particular act set a precedent for the burning of Jewish books by the enemies of the Jewish people throughout the centuries. So it was a horrible thing. Not that that was the only time a Torah scroll was ever burned, but it was a big deal. It may have been the first time, even though it wasn't the last. But it led to this precedent. It set this precedent that Jewish books would be burned by the enemies of the Jewish people as a way of thumbing their nose, if you will, at our faith and trying to disconnect us from our faith, because our enemies have always known, and you can even see it from stories in the Torah and the Tanakh, they have always known that our biggest strength is our faith in God. And so if they could find ways to disconnect us from our faith, then they would be able to weaken us and eventually destroy us. So they thought. And number 5, according to tradition, this was also the date on which an idolatrous image was placed in the sanctuary of the Holy Temple, which of course caused its desecration. So those are, 5 major things. There are probably other bad things that have happened on the 17th of Tammuz, but those are the 5 major things that we are told we are commemorating when we fast on the 17th of Tammuz. Now, on Tisha B'av, we commemorate the following events. 1, it was on the 9th of Av in 1313 BCE, that's before the Christian era, that the spies returned from their exploration of the land of Israel. Remember, Moshe sent out 12 spies, and when they came back, 10 of them gave a negative report. It was actually on the 8th that they returned, but it was on the 9th that the children of Israel believed the report, began to cry, and insisted that they'd rather go back to Egypt than be slaughtered by the Canaanites. Of course, this resulted in those alive at the time being condemned to die in the desert, leaving only their children to enter the land 38 years later. Number 2, The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians on the 9th of Av, as we've already discussed. And as I also mentioned earlier, on the same date, 490 years later, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans, and it continued to burn into the 10th day, which will come up again when we're talking about how we observe the day. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, number 4, there was a brutal battle in the town of Beitar on that day, approximately 73 years later, during the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans. The Jewish rebels were brutally butchered, and 1 year later, the Romans completely plowed over the Holy Temple, burying it for more than 2,000 years. Now, those are the more ancient things that happen on Tisha B'av. There's a few things that are also more modern that happen on Tisha B'av. Actually, there's quite a few more than what I put on the screens. There are a few more things that happened that are not on the screen. But number one, the Jewish people were expelled from England in 1290. Everybody knows about the Jews being expelled from Spain, but a lot of people don't know that the Jews were first expelled by the English. So if you think that that Spain has a reputation for being anti-Semitic, well, I have news for you. England beat them to it. So in 1290, the Jews were expelled from England, and in 1492, 202 years later, on Tisha B'av, that was the date that all the Jews had to leave Spain. It also happened that the First World War effectually began when Germany declared war on Russia on the 9th of Av. And it's felt that World War II and the Holocaust were really just a continuation, a small break, big break, of World War I. Of course, we also have other things, even in more modern time, that are perhaps more applicable to people who live in Israel. But there are a lot of negative things, bad things that have started or happened on the 9th of Av here in Israel as well, in modern times. So the 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av are considered a period of mourning for the Jewish people. And during this time, our Haftorah, rather than relating to the Torah portion for those 3 weeks, comes from selections of the prophets that are called the 3 Haftorahs of calamity. I'm not going to go into any details about that because today we're really talking about the significance and how we observe the 9 days and Tisha B'av in particular. So in a few minutes, we're also going to talk about a couple of topics related to the 3 weeks, actually just one, but and Tisha B'av. But before we go there, I really want to cover some very practical things. Okay, Judaism is a faith which is approximately 5,000 years old. And that means that we have a lot of traditions and ways in which we do things. Some of them go all the way back to Abraham. Others were transmitted directly from God to Moshe. And some of those were written down, and others were passed on orally until they were finally written down in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Others were incorporated by the sages because they were deemed appropriate to the observance of this important time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the 3 weeks begins with the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, and these 3 weeks are considered a dangerous time for the Jewish people. Well, if you look at history, it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, look at all of the stuff that's happened, not only on the 17th and on the 9th, but so many bad things have happened between the two. I just haven't covered them because it's not a history lesson per se. Then anyway, so this time is considered a very dangerous time for the Jewish people. And so we avoid activities that would be considered dangerous. And we also avoid activities that are associated with celebration. Now, please note that there is some variation in the custom, as almost everything I teach you, because when the Jewish people were dispersed, the first dispersion by the Babylonians and then the second one by the Romans, communities were created all over the world, small Jewish communities. And each community was virtually isolated from other communities. And so each community created its own customs, and where things weren't written down yet, some of the choices that were made by the leaderships of those communities were a little bit different. It doesn't mean that anybody is right or wrong, it's just different. A lot of people assume that Sephardi custom and Sephardi way of doing things is the authentic Jewish way because we associate the Sephardi customs with what's actually called Edot HaMizrach, or the people of the East, the Jews who either lived in Spain or remained in the Middle East, in Arab countries. However, their communities grew and changed over time too. So, you know, every community has its own history and every community has its own set of traditions because every community grew and developed by itself. And so nobody's customs are right or wrong, or certainly not more right or more wrong. They're just different. And that's an important principle for us to remember when we're interacting with other Jewish people. I found sometimes people, when they become religious, will often bring with them a certain arrogance that because they learned a specific thing or something made sense to them in their own minds, that they become very dogmatic about what's right and what's wrong, and they fail to realize that this is actually the core of our problem to begin with. And we'll look at that a little bit in a couple of minutes, this idea of the arrogance and believing that we know better than our brother or sister, leading to what's called baseless hatred, or sinat chinam, which was the reason for the destruction of the temples in the first place. So anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is just that there are different sets of customs depending on the community that your Jewish background comes from. Obviously, the two biggest divisions are Ashkenazi and Sephardi, but even within those, there are variations. And of course, we also have Yemenite and Moroccan and Ethiopian and all different kinds of communities where there are even more differences. Now, I'm Ashkenazi, so I'm going to be speaking to you about the Ashkenazi traditions, and where I know that there's a difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi, I'll let you know. But the best thing for you to do, obviously, is to ask your own rabbi if you have a question. All right. And part of the reason for going over this is that some of my students don't live in a community or don't have the kind of relationship with a rabbi that they feel comfortable going to him and asking questions. So I just want to make sure that at least some of this is covered for you all. So Ashkenazi refers to Jews who are basically of European descent, whereas Sephardi refers to Jews who are basically of either Spanish or Middle Eastern descent. Okay, that's kind of very generalized, but gives you the idea. Okay, so for Ashkenazi Jews, the customs start on the 17th of Tammuz, but they get more restrictive starting Rosh Chodesh Av, okay, the first of the month of Av, which is 9 days before Tisha B'av. Many, or I would even say most Sephardim generally observe the stricter observance only starting the week of Tisha B'av. Now this year, because Tisha B'av is on a Sunday, therefore there is no week of Tisha B'av. Now some Sephardim, in order to be more careful, will start the week before, so they would have started on Sunday, whereas others this year won't have these more severe restrictions except on the day of Tisha B'av. During the 3 weeks, we do not go on trips or excursions. The Gemara even says not to go walking about your garden. Many people won't fly, even for business purposes. So you get two topics or two reasons kind of mixed in together here. What is it about trips and excursions? So the one part of a trip or excursion is that it's a lot of fun. So I was talking about the fact that when we're talking about trips and excursions, we're kind of mixing up two different concepts in one. All right. The first one is this idea of danger, right? So a lot of people won't fly or go even on long driving trips. They won't go on a boat. They won't do things like that during the 9 days. Some even during the 3 weeks. But the other issue that's kind of mixed up in this subject is pleasure. So as I started to say before, the Gemara says that you shouldn't even go on a walk in your garden. So obviously, why do we go on vacation? Now, of course, there's a whole long discussion about how mental illness, or mental health rather, figures in. And so this is the reason that we have rabbis to ask questions of, because sometimes there are exceptions made. If somebody, for example, really needs to go on vacation, this is the only time they can go on a vacation, they may be able to get permission in order to do it. But in general, because this is a time when we're supposed to be feeling the heaviness of the loss that we incurred by the loss of the temple and the closeness with God that was removed from us with the loss of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, we don't go on vacations during these 3 weeks. We don't do anything that brings excessive pleasure, great pleasure. That doesn't mean that you don't do anything that isn't pleasant. There was a whole discussion on a Facebook group I'm in, should we eat chocolate during the 9 days, for example? Should we eat chocolate? Chocolate's very pleasant, right? It's something we enjoy. Well, there's no prohibition against eating chocolate during the 9 days. But if it's something that makes you feel like it's so pleasant that it takes away from the feeling of mourning, then maybe you shouldn't do it. So anyway, so during the 3 weeks, we do not go on trips or excursions, both because of the danger and because of the pleasure aspects of it. A lot of people won't go to the beach at all, although it's not prohibited until the 9 days, which we'll see in just a minute. Basically, don't do anything that's considered dangerous, all right? So, that's subjective. And really, that's the thing, is that, there's a lot of things in Judaism that really are based on the individual person and where your mindset is. And I remember one time when I was new to being a religious Jew, I had a question for a rabbi. I had a friend who had gotten permission to do something which was a leniency, and I wanted that leniency too. And I went to the rabbi and I asked him if I could have permission to do that too. And he asked me why I wanted to do that. And I had to admit it was pure vanity, that there was no other real reason for me to be seeking permission to do it. And my rabbi said, no, you can't do that. So one of the beautiful things about Judaism is that even though there are some very strict guidelines and halachas and laws that have very clear boundaries that you cannot cross, at the same time, it's a living, breathing religion that allows for the individual needs. And that's really kind of cool, I think. A lot of people think of Judaism as being very rigid, but in many ways it's not. All right, so moving on to things that we don't do during the 3 weeks. We also don't have weddings or engagements. And not that a person can't get engaged during the 3 weeks. They say that if, and I believe this is found also in the Gemara, if a young man wants to propose to a young woman, he's made up his mind that he wants to marry her, and it's during the 3 weeks, he's allowed to propose to her during the 3 weeks. It's just that the engagement party, normally we call it a vort, which is Yiddish for, a speech, because that's what you do at these kinds of things. But anyway, the celebration is to be put off until after the 10th of Av. But the young man may certainly propose to the young woman during this time, but we don't have any celebrations, so it's kept very quiet and until after the 10th, and then they have the celebration. But we for sure don't have any weddings until after the 10th. We also don't have any parties. We don't have any public celebrations of any kind, and we don't play music. Now, this one is really interesting because the definition of music, if you think about it, back in the times of the Gemara, they didn't have recording devices, right? If you were listening to music, it's because somebody was performing it live. And a performance is considered like a party. It's considered a joyful event. And so the performance of live instrumental music is prohibited during this time. Now, in the modern era, we have a lot of questions. What do we do with recorded music? So basically, the modern take on the listening to music during the 3 weeks, and specifically the 9 days, is that we don't listen to live instrumental music. Most people don't listen to recorded instrumental music. However, most rabbis have ruled that listening to a cappella music is permissible. Now, in the modern era, we have a new phenomenon, which is incredibly talented a cappella singers who use recording devices and other electronic things to take their voices and create music, which really does sound instrumental, even though it's not, it's all voices. So some people will listen to that during the 9 days or 3 weeks, and some people will not. So again, this just depends on where you're at. Now, there are some people who get very depressed if they don't listen to music. And so there are some rabbis who have said that if you just can't manage, if you're going to break down or become suicidal, God forbid, because you're not listening to music during these 3 weeks, then you can listen to music, but it should be done privately, like with headphones on. It's not something that should be done publicly. Now, that being said, if you get on a bus and they're playing music, or you walk into a store and they're playing music, you do not have to leave the store or get off the bus. All right. You're allowed to be in the presence of music. We just don't listen to music ourselves. Okay. The next restriction during the 3 weeks is that we don't make the blessing of Shehechianu. What's Shehechianu? Shehechianu is the blessing that we say, we thank God for bringing us to this season. And it's a blessing that we say is when we experience something that gives us great joy. So for example, is the blessing we say when we get new clothing. It's a blessing we say when we see somebody that is very dear to us that we haven't seen in a very long time. It's a blessing that we say when we arrive somewhere that is special to us that we haven't been in a long time. A lot of people will make the Shechianu when they arrive in Israel after not being in Israel for a while. So we don't do any activities that would bring us to want to say the Shehechianu, because we don't say the Shehechianu during the 3 weeks. All right. And then lastly on this list is that we do not cut our hair, and men do not shave their beards. Now, rabbis tend to be lenient on women, especially if they need to go to the mikvah or if they need to shave in order to keep themselves presentable and make themselves still feel beautiful. You're not supposed to make yourself ugly, all right? So if, not shaving or whatever would make you feel ugly or self-conscious around your husband or whatever, then you're allowed to do that. But generally, we don't cut our hair, and men don't shave their beards at all during the 3 weeks. So it's really funny if you know an Orthodox Jewish man who is a little bit more modern, who is clean shaven, which is permissible by some. Although many do not shave, there are many Orthodox men who do shave. However, you may notice that they are growing beards during this 3 weeks. There are 2 periods of the year when men don't shave their beards: the 3 weeks between Tammuz and Tisha B'av, and the period of 50 days between Passover and Shavuot. So that's called Sphira, and so you may hear people talk about their Sphira beard. 3 weeks is a little shorter, so their beards don't grow quite as much, but some men seem to be very proficient at growing a beard, and so they will look like a hairy beast by the end of 3 weeks. But the day after Tisha B'av, you better believe they'll be shaving. Now, my husband doesn't shave his beard. He does trim it, though. He keeps it short-ish, and so he will not be trimming it during the 3 weeks. He will also not trim his hair. The reason for these restrictions, again, is because of the fact that we are in mourning, and especially some of them don't make sense to modern people today. Like, what does cutting your hair have to do with being in mourning? I don't think modern secular people would think twice about getting a haircut if they felt they needed one, even while they are in mourning. But remember, many of these laws were passed down during ancient times when these were signs of a person being in mourning. Okay, now we're down to the 9 days. Like I said, the 9 days began on Friday. And so now we're several days into the 9 days. Once we enter the month of Av, we get even more strict. There is a saying in Gemara, maybe you've heard, that when the month of Adar, which is usually in February, when the month of Adar enters, we increase our joy. And there is a conversive comment in the Gemara that when the month of Av enters, we decrease our joy. So when the month of Av enters, we become even more strict with our observance. During these 9 days, Orthodox Jews do not eat meat. That's chicken and beef and lamb and things like that. Fish doesn't count, so you can eat fish, but we do not eat meat or drink wine or grape juice except on Shabbat. Again, we don't mourn on Shabbat, so Orthodox Jews who do not eat meat during the week will eat meat for Shabbat during that period of time. So, and they will drink wine or grape juice for Kiddush, obviously. Next, we do not wear clean clothes. This is one that makes people freak out when they hear it. But it's really, we don't wear freshly laundered clothes. Now, most people can wear clothes more than once before they throw them in the wash. Not all people make their clothes filthy and stinky every single time they wear them. I mean, sometimes, sure, if I'm cooking in something, it may not be suitable to wear it a second time, or if I'm babysitting my granddaughter and she throws up on me or something like that, obviously I'm not going to be able to wear it a second time. But most normal adults are able to wear clothes more than once. We don't wear clean clothes because, remember, back in the time of the Gemara, people didn't have that many outfits. And it wasn't that they washed their clothes every other day, because washing the clothes was a several-day procedure. So they wore their clothes many, many, many times before they laundered them. That means that freshly laundered clothes was considered something very pleasant. It was a joy to put on freshly laundered clothes. A lot like, putting fresh sheets on your bed and then climbing in between the fresh sheets, right? It's something that's very pleasant. And so we don't do that. We don't wear freshly laundered clothes. We don't change our linens during the 9 days. Now, if you find yourself in a situation where you have to launder your clothes because you just don't have enough clothes anymore and they're filthy beyond the ability to wear them and get away with it, or they stink, you are allowed to wash just what you will need to get you through the 9 days. And then there's 2 different ways that people deal with this issue. You're still not supposed to wear clean clothes. So after they're washed, a lot of people will throw them on the floor. There are people who, right before the 9 days, will take all of their clean clothes and they'll put them on for half an hour at a time, like in one day, like put on a shirt and go daven the shacharit, and then come home and put on a second shirt and have breakfast and put on a third shirt, and not on top of each other. They change their clothes. So they'll prepare, 9 clothes, 9 shirts anyway, so that they're technically not freshly laundered because they were worn for a half an hour each. I think tossing it on the floor is actually a lot easier. But the putting them on only works if you're doing it before the 9 days anyway. So we also don't launder clothes. We don't throw clothes in the washing machine during the 9 days. So like I said, however, if you are a minimalist and don't have enough clothes, or children, by the way, are another category. Baby clothes, you can always wash them if you need to. But if you're a minimalist and you just don't have 9 days worth of clothes in your closet, you are allowed to wash just what you will need to get through the week. And like I said, a lot of people will throw it on the floor in order to consider it not freshly laundered anymore before they put it in their closet and wear it. Okay? Now, most people during the 9 days will not engage in any business transactions or large purchases. One year, we were looking for a new place to rent, And the timing was pretty drastic because we had to move shortly after Tisha B'av, and we were running out of time because it was a complicated situation. But anyway, so we found a house. It was during the 9 days, and so we had a verbal agreement with the landlord, and we didn't sign the papers until after Tisha B'av. They didn't want us to sign, and we didn't want to sign, so we didn't. So technically, there was no actual business transaction during that time. People will not drive cars. By the way, if anything that I'm saying sparks a question, feel free to put it in the chat. Hopefully it will notify me that somebody chatted, as a question in the chat. And I'll look up at it and see about answering it if I can. So people don't engage in any important business decisions. That doesn't mean that they won't pay a bill or that they won't buy something small, but large purchases, house, car, signing contracts of any kind, usually people will not do that during the 9 days. Also, we do not bathe during the 9 days. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, in ancient times, people didn't take baths very often, once a month, twice a month. So to go 9 days without bathing was like not abnormal. And so the point was that you don't go out of your way to make yourself clean during this time. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. Our hygiene, our norms, societal hygiene norms, most people shower more than once a week, and most of us would feel dirty and stinky if we go 9 days without showering. So today, the rabbis have ruled that if you need to shower for hygiene purposes, you may shower. It's just that you should use slightly colder water than you're used to, and you should try to make the shower shorter. Just wash what you need to wash. Don't shower for pleasure, only for need. Get in and out as quickly as possible. Okay, so when we say we don't bathe for pleasure. We don't take prolonged showers or baths. We just get in, clean what needs cleaning, and get out. Okay, but you can use soap, you can use shampoo, you can use anything that you need to use in order to accomplish that. Tisha B'av itself is a 25-hour fast, and the day begins at sundown. Just trying to click on something that's not clicking. Okay, Tisha B'av itself is a 25-hour fast, and we begin the fast at sundown, which is the official beginning of a new Jewish day. During the evening prayer service at the synagogue at Shul, there is a reading of the book of Eicha, which is the book of Lamentations. All right, at this point, we do not wear leather shoes, and at Shul, everyone sits on the floor on a low chair, and we do not greet one another. All right. So what happens is that this year, because Tisha B'av starts right at the end of Shabbat, the evening prayer service at the synagogue is delayed just a little bit so that people can say Baruch Hamav D'Albein Kodesh L'chol, which is the phrase that you can say at the end of Shabbat to break Shabbat before you have time to do Havdalah, which is the end of Shabbat ceremony. And it gives people enough time to say that and to change out of their Shabbat clothes and out of their Shabbat shoes and dress more appropriately in order to be able to get to Shul. When we get to Shul, everybody sits on the floor or on a low chair. Older people like me who have trouble sitting on the floor will often bring a stool with them so that they can sit. And nobody greets each other. You don't say hello. You're not even really supposed to nod. You're just supposed to come into Shul and sit down, and they will begin the reading of the book of Eicha. We listen to it twice, once in the evening and again in the morning. Now, during Tisha B'av, we don't bathe at all. That day, you can put it off one day, just like on Shabbat, we don't bathe. On Tisha B'av, we don't bathe unless there's a specific need. If you have an issue that comes up and for hygiene purposes, you need to wash something, wash that something, but only wash that something. So, but children are an exception. If a child needs washing, you're allowed to wash the child. Okay. We also don't anoint oneself for pleasure. In other words, no perfume, and most women don't put on makeup. hand cream unless you need it because your body is super dry or whatever. But you may put on deodorant. We do wear deodorant on Tisha B'av. Maybe we need it even more because we're not bathing. Also, and this could be important for some people, we also abstain from marital relations on Tisha B'av specifically. This is like one of the big ones. We don't eat on Tisha B'av. We don't wear leather on Tisha B'av. And we don't engage in marital relations on Tisha B'av. Now, there are many people who are extra strict with themselves and they choose not to sleep with a pillow on Tisha B'av, and there are some people who will even sleep on the hard floor on Tisha B'av. I'm not saying that you have to, I'm just letting you know that that's something that is done. We also do not learn Torah during Tisha B'av. Now, that may be something that may surprise you. Why don't we learn Torah on Tisha B'av? Because on Tisha B'av, we're abstaining from things that give us pleasure. And learning Torah is something that is very pleasant, right? And it gives us pleasure. And when one is mourning, they do not do things that give them pleasure. Now, that doesn't mean you can't read anything from the Tanakh. It is permitted to learn texts that are relevant to Tisha B'av, such as the Book of Lamentations. The rabbis have said you could learn the Book of Job, Iyov, parts of Tractate Moed Katan or Gittin or Sanhedrin, the laws of mourning, the laws of fasting from Ta'anit. But in-depth study should be avoided because it's assumed that that study is something that gives you great pleasure. In the morning, on the day of Tisha B'av, there is a second reading of Eicha in the shul as part of the morning prayer service. And yes, women also go to that. Now, the restrictions of Tisha B'av, interestingly enough, actually continue until noon on the 10th, the day after, because the burning of the temple actually continued through the 10th of Av. This year, however, because the fast is pushed off a day, basically we're fasting on the 10th instead of the 9th, after the fast is over, we may resume most of the activities, and by the morning, we can resume all of the activities. Now, Tisha B'av is not a Shabbat. It's not a Sabbath, and therefore, technically, one may do all normal work-like activities. In other words, you can get on your computer, you can turn on lights, you can drive. We don't go to work unless you must go to work to avoid a loss. In other words, if you would risk being fired or you wouldn't be able to feed your family if you don't go to work one day, then you may go to work on Tisha B'av. But all of the other rules, restrictions rather, of Tisha B'av still apply even if you have to go to work. Now, because of the restrictions on Torah study and the fact that it's not a Shabbat, and I mean, like, let's face it, if you're not eating and you're not studying Torah, that makes for a very long day, especially because you also don't want to engage in playing games. You're not going to go on walks. So what do you do all day on Tisha B'av? Well, I'm not sure what people did before there was a TV, but many people today pass the time during the day of Tisha B'av by watching movies about the burning of the temple or about the Holocaust or different things like that. And of course, you know, we have some famous movies about the Holocaust. You have Schindler's List, you have Number of the Stars, you have Paper Clips, you have, I mean, that's a little different, but you have, I think Jacob the Liar is another one. There's The Pianist or something. Anyway, there's a lot of movies about the Holocaust that have been produced over the years, and I'm sure that you can, or you can just simply go online and Google destruction of the temple, and I'm sure that you'll find some videos that will come up about that. So a lot of people will read, will watch movies about that. Because the land of Israel is so important to me and my husband, frequently we'll watch videos having to do with the beginnings of the state when England was not allowing Jews to enter Israel, and so they were turning them back and people were being killed. Any movie that focuses on anti-Semitism or things like that would also be appropriate. A movie on the Inquisition, for example, or the expulsion of Jews from Spain would also be appropriate. All right, so we know that man was created in the image of God, right? We read that in the beginning of Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 1, verse 27. And we know from the first couple of chapters of the Torah that God is a creative God. In fact, this is our introduction to Hashem. He is powerful and he is creative, and he created the universe out of nothing but his words. From this, we learn that people created in God's image are also powerful and creative. While it's true that we are limited by our physicality in what we can create, still our words create reality. We already talked about the 3 weeks, but it's interesting to note that the sages explain that the reason for the destruction of the second temple was something called sinat chinam. That means baseless hatred. It said that the people didn't respect each other, and what's the biggest symptom of disrespect? It's how we speak to and about one another. Our speech is the main facilitator of baseless hatred. Therefore, it is speech which was the primary vehicle for the destruction of the second temple. So, based on that, it's really great idea to take upon oneself during this time of the year to learn, for example, the laws of Lashon Hara, or negative speech, because our speech is so powerful. And the destruction of the temple, at least the second temple, was fully because of the way that people spoke to and about each other. Now, the destruction of the first temple is most often attributed to idolatry, but it's also considered a temporary destruction. So anyway, this past week, the Parsha that we learned, in the Parsha, we learned about vows, which is our nedarim, and that our words not only create reality, but that they're binding and that they can bestow a status of holiness on an object. But our words not only have the power to transform the mundane into the holy, they also have the ability to transform the permissible into the forbidden. So this is a powerful gift that can be used to do tremendous good in the world or tremendous harm. Now, I have a whole bunch more things to say about this, but I think that I'm just going to skip down, and I'm going to mention one thing. It says in Mishle, which is Proverbs 13:3, that the mouth holds the key to life and death. It says, "He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction." So it's important for us to remember that our words are the conduit for spiritual power in this world. Okay, and so we need to learn to be careful to use them only to unlock good and not evil. And the way that we can rectify this sin of baseless hatred that resulted in the destruction of the temple is by being mindful of our speech and only speaking good into this world. When we speak good, we're creating that conduit between this world and the spiritual realm, and we're drawing God's presence into this world, and thus undoing, to a small degree, the lack of presence created by the destruction of the temple. We bring God closer to this world, bringing the world closer to perfection and bringing redemption to being a closer reality. All right. So just one more thought, just a very quick thought, that this comes from my husband. That was really brilliant. He was talking about the picture which is painted by the concept of the 3 weeks. If you think about it, in both cases of the first temple and the second temple, the 17th of Tammuz marked a breach in the walls and a siege, usually. And then after 3 weeks, the temple was destroyed. And so he points out that feeling completely disengaged from God, basically the destruction of our relationship with God, doesn't just happen. If you're feeling distanced from God, it starts with the little things. It starts by allowing certain things to creep in. It starts by allowing small breaches in the wall, if you will, right? You can't, the Holy of Holies, that spiritual center of who you are, cannot be destroyed without first allowing things in, which means that there's a period of time in which you can fix it, you can stop it. So when you start to see things happening, keep in mind that it's not going to happen all at once, and that what starts with a small breach in the wall listening to Lashon Hara, speaking Lashon Hara, doing other things that put a wedge in our relationship with Hashem that can lead to a total disconnect doesn't happen all at once. It takes time. Little by little, one thing leads to another. So if you sense that something in your life is distancing you from Hashem, you can deal with it now while it's only a breach in the wall. Don't let it become full-blown destruction. You have the power in your hands to prevent it. Farah?
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes?
Hi. Shalom. My question is, how can we start our fast on 22 July?
Okay. So when Shabbat is over in the evening, Saturday night,
Okay.
when Shabbat is over, actually at candlelighting time rather than Shabbat is over. You know how, like, let's say candlelighting time was 7 o'clock and Shabbat will be over 8 o'clock the next night, right?
Yes, yes,
But
yes.
but on Saturday night, the same time that you lit candles the night before. So if you lit candles Friday night, 7 o'clock,
Okay.
7 o'clock on Shabbat is when you start, okay? Because
Okay.
that in between time is like it's Shabbat still, but not really. Now that means that your third meal needs to finish before candle lighting time, and you should eat a decent meal. It's a mitzvah to eat a big meal Saturday afternoon, evening,
Okay.
just before candle lighting time. But you finish at candle lighting time or just before,
Yes.
and
Yes.
then you don't eat anything, you don't drink anything until the next evening when Shabbat would be over. So
Okay.
with my example, if candle lighting was at 7 p.m. on Friday night, then at
Okay.
7 p.m. on Saturday night, you will stop eating. At
Okay.
8 p.m. on Sunday night, you break the fast.
Yes.
You will break the
Okay. I got it. Okay. I got it.
You don't have to do a special ceremony or anything. You can just, because it's not a Shabbat, you can just break the fast. We do Havdalah on Saturday night, on Sunday night. Saturday night, we're going to do the candle part of Havdalah, but we're not going to do the wine or the spices. Okay?
Okay.
Because it's Tisha B'av. And then on Sunday night, when the fast is over, we will do the last part of Havdalah, which is the last prayer and the blessing over the grape juice. Okay? We don't do any spices for Havdalah this time.
Also, second question is mine. My kids want to take this fast. Is it permission for them? My son age is 13 and my daughter age is 11. They both want to take this fast. So is this permission for them?
Okay, so the son who's 13 should fast because he's bar mitzvah age. But the daughter who is under 12 is not yet bat mitzvah and she should not fast. Now, what some parents will do is if the child really wants to fast, they'll tell the child to fast until midday. But you don't want to endanger the child's health, so they're not supposed to fast a complete fast. So I would say, of course, the rest of the evening and into the morning, maybe until noon, and then they should eat something.
Thank you so much, Penina.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Okay.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have a pleasant rest of the week. And although it's funny I said the word pleasant, also you should know something that I forgot to mention during the class, but it is common during this week or leading up to any fast, actually, for people to greet each other by saying you should have an easy and meaningful fast. And a lot of people are offended. Why are we telling people to have an easy fast if we're supposed to be afflicting ourselves? It's not supposed to be easy. Well, the truth is that it's not supposed to be so hard that you're distracted from the main purpose. So I always say have an easy and meaningful fast when I see people before, leading up to Tisha B'av. So just so you know, it's very common to wish people an easy fast. I add meaningful, have an easy and meaningful fast. So may you all have an easy and meaningful fast, and I look forward to learning again with you next week. Be well.